Russia in British Strategic Foreign Policy 1860 to 1941. A 57-minute presentation sponsored by the Defence Studies Department, held at the JSCSC Neilson Lecture Theatre at Shrivenham on the 20th of January 2006. Unfortunately, some parts of this recording are distorted, but this should not detract from the content of the presentation. The speaker is Professor Keith Neilson, who is a member of the History Department of the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. He is a graduate of Cambridge University and is Canada's leading international historian. He was the head of the History Department at RMC from 1991 to 1994, and his main focus of research has been on Anglo-Russian strategic relations in the period 1880 to 1941, and in particular the concepts of Imperial Defence and strategic foreign policy creation. Professor Keith Neilson.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about Russia, which I will argue is the principal threat to the British Empire from at least Napoleon's time until 1941, and indeed perhaps longer. Despite the fact that the two countries had collaborated to defeat Napoleon's attempt to establish French hegemony in Europe, and despite the fact that fear of France bound Russia and Britain together until possibly 1848, Russia was seen as Britain's greatest threat generally. I shall argue here that with brief and rather violent exceptions, the First and Second World Wars, Russia in both its Tsarist and Soviet guises remained Britain's foremost threat until perhaps as late as 1991. But for the purposes of today's lecture, I shall concentrate on the period from 1856 to 1941. The Anglo-Russian antagonism in the 19th century stemmed from a variety of factors. The first was ideological. Britain and Russia occupied opposite ends of the political spectrum. Until 1905, Russia was an autocracy. The Tsar, both in theory and in some ways in practice, had no fetters on his autocratic powers. Until 1861, the bulk of the Russian population were serfs, lacking any legal rights. And in fact, their position was similar to that of Afro-Americans in the antebellum South in the United States. Even after emancipation, the rights of the newly created peasantry were few, and Russian law, at the local level in particular, was arbitrary. Lacking any representative institutions, Russia had no legal political parties until 1905, and thus all political activity was illegal. This drove political discontent underground, and Russia was famed for political exile, both to Europe and even more famously to Siberia, which in the British lexicon of the 19th century was the equivalent to the 20th century's Gulag. Russia was the home of secret police, arbitrary injustice, and a lack of political freedom. All of this contrasted in the 19th century with an increasingly democratic Britain. The powers of the British monarchy, already far less than that of an autocrat, declined throughout the 19th century. The electorate expanded throughout the time, with successive reform acts bringing more and more of the population into the political arena. The ideas of personal liberty, the rights of Englishmen, both collectively and individually, expanded. Secret police were viewed as something exclusively continental. Europe, in fact, was viewed in Bernard Porter's phrase as the home of bureau, meaning bureaucracy, and barrack, where the government interfered overmuch in the life of the nation's inhabitants, and the army occupied too large a role in public life. Russia was felt to be the antithesis of everything that made Britain the beacon of liberty. But it was in international relations, and particularly in British Imperial Defence policy, that Russia was an exclusive threat. The Crimean War had for the British been an anti-Russian war on a global basis. Not only had British forces engaged a Russian force in the Crimea, but the Royal Navy had acted globally in the Far East and the Baltic against the Tsar's forces. Indeed, the British were reluctant to bring the war to a close in the aftermath of the Battle of Sevastopol, since they had constructed a flotilla of specially designed ships intended to bring the war to the Russians in the Gulf of Finland. The terms of the Treaty of Paris ending the war reflected Britain's concerns with retaining some means of striking at Russia should the occasion warrant. The Black Sea clauses of the treaty prevented Russia from fortifying the Black Sea ports, meaning that the Royal Navy would be able to act as a deterrent and a lever against Russia in the future. Of course, the Crimean War was also a trigger for Russian reform and a change in Russian diplomatic policy. This was Gorchakov's famous policy of reculement, or of resting. On the international scene, Russia occupies a quiet role, abandoning Nicholas I's idea of being the gendarme of Europe. Remember that in the period from 1826 until the Crimean War, Russia was willing to send its forces everywhere the evils of democracy and liberty should arise in Europe. And after the Crimean War, Russia intervenes only in Europe, only where her interests warrant, such as during the Polish uprising in the 1860s. Although St. Petersburg does take advantage of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to repudiate the Black Sea clauses of the Treaty of Paris, which then allows Russia to fortify the Black Sea after this. However, before all of this, Russia's armies needed refurbishing after the failures of the Crimean War. And what were required were some victories against technologically inferior opponents in venues where any setbacks would not be visible to the external world. And the venue of choice is here in Central Asia. Accordingly, Russia begins a long expansion in the 1860s, conquering over the next 20 years a vast new empire stretching to the Tian Shan Mountains in the south and bounded on the west by the Caspian and to the east by China and Xinjiang province. Now this expansion, this Russian expansion, was of course not without interest for the British. Russian expansion into Central Asia triggered fears for the defense of India. And these fears were made all the more potent by the fact that the Indian Mutiny of 1857 had raised the specter of a domestic threat to British rule in India. The Russian drive to the south was thought both to threaten Britain's position in Afghanistan and India by the force of Russian arms and by the possibility that any Russian incursion in this area might inspire native unrest on the northwest frontier. Thus, from the 1860s onwards, the defense of the northwest frontier for Britain becomes the focus of British military policy and for imperial defense. Now this has both a diplomatic and a military aspect. Diplomatically, the British protested ineffectually against Russian depredations. These protests were met with bland denials of responsibility, with Tsarist foreign ministers always insisting that the advances were the actions of men on the spot and beyond the ability of the government to control them. On occasion, such men were even recalled, but generally then given substantial rewards. For example, Alexander II's injunction to General K.P. Kaufmann, Konstantin Petrovich, take Khiva, which is yonder, for me, certainly tended to undermine any faith, any small faith in Russian veracity that was held in London. Militarily speaking, the defense of India generated two competing schools of thought. The forward school, which advocated expanding the borders of British India to include Afghanistan, thus enabling the use of the natural barrier that the Himalayas formed against Russian encroachments, and a more passive school that advocated defending the jewel in the crown on its existing frontiers. Each side had its adherents, and neither gained a lasting predominance. The limiting factor was always men and money, since providing sufficient British troops to stiffen the Indian Army was a difficult task, as was convincing either a British Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Government of India to provide the sums necessary to pay for such things. However, India was not the only potential Anglo-Russian flashpoint. By the 1890s, Russia's increasing interest in the Far East offered another possible location for an Anglo-Russian clash. The aftermath of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 provided a perfect opportunity for the latent Anglo-Russian hostility in the Far East to emerge. In 1895, Russia joined with France and Germany in the so-called Triple Intervention to deny Japan the fruits of its victory against China. Despite being enjoined by the other three powers to join in this coercion of Japan and to strip away some of the territory which Japan had managed to take from China, Britain abstained, seeing no advantage to curbing Japan's emerging strength to the advantage of its European rivals, particularly Russia, in China. By itself, this would have meant little. But when first Germany and then Russia pressed the Chinese government to lease them ports, in the case of the Germans, Tsingtao, and Tsingtao is yonder, and Port Arthur to the Russians, this meant that there was a distinct threat to Britain's imperial position in China. The possession of a warm water port by Russia in conjunction with the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which its construction had begun in 1891 and was scheduled for completion in 1903, although they were a bit slow on finishing up the railway, meant that Russia would become a commercial rival, with her railway offering a cheaper means of moving Chinese goods to the European market than could Britain's maritime marine. And the Trans-Siberian's construction had other ramifications. If we could go back to that map of Central Asia, a spur line from Orenburg, near Ekaterinburg there, down to Tashkent in Central Asia had important implications for the defense of India. This meant that Tsarist troops would have easier and particularly quicker access to the northwest frontier than ever before. Now, the implications of all of this were evident during the early phases of the Boer War. At that time, Russia threatened to organize a European coalition against Britain, and, more seriously for imperial defense, it was feared that Russia would take advantage of the circumstances to threaten Persia and hence India. George Curzon, the Viceroy of India, was adamant that any Russian moves against Persia should be resisted. However, Lloyd George Hamilton, the British Secretary of State for India, pointed out the difficulties. He informed Curzon in November of 1899, and I quote, "I have felt for a very long time past that we must, so far as Russia is concerned, acknowledge the changed conditions that the extension of railways has made in the relative fighting power of Great Britain and Russia." Now, this reflected the logistic realities of the defense of the northwest frontier. Until the building of Russian railways into Central Asia, Britain was able to provide troops from Britain for the defense of the northwest frontier more quickly than Russia could send forces from European Russia to threaten it. Just as Britain and France had had a logistic advantage in the Crimean War, utilizing seaborne transport as opposed to Russia's overland transport, so too could Britain send men through the Suez Canal to India more quickly than the Russians could get forces by land to the same region. The advent of railways changed this entirely, adding a new dimension to the Russian threat and creating a new aspect for imperial defense. Russia was also, staying on this navalist theme, a naval threat with all of that implies for imperial defense. Last lecture I talked about how the Royal Navy is the underpinning of imperial defense globally. Beginning in 1889, British naval policy was set upon the basis of the so-called two-power standard, under the terms of which the Royal Navy was constructed to match the combined fleets of the next two largest naval powers. Now, the formation 5 years later of the Franco-Russian Pact in 1894 meant that the Royal Navy was built on the basis of dealing with the combined Franco-Russian fleets. In particular, this raised concerns about the security of the Mediterranean. One of the major planning fears of the British fleet in the period between 1894 and 1904 was that a British fleet in the Mediterranean would be caught between a French fleet sailing out of Marseille and a Russian fleet debouching out of the Black Sea. Thus, Russian naval building programs had to be watched extremely carefully. And this, again, undermines the thesis of the idea of Germany as the driving motive power in British naval building. In 1898-1899, which is almost always the date chosen as the beginning of the Anglo-German naval rivalry, with Tirpitz's beginning his construction of the so-called Risk Fleet, it was the building of Russian cruisers that prompted George Goschen, the First Lord of the Admiralty, to talk about those cursed Russians driving up British naval estimates at this period. The Russian menace, in fact, in 1900 is everywhere for the British. It's in China, it's in on the northwest frontier of India, it's at sea, and of course it is in Europe with the threat that the Russian alliance poses to the balance of power. Therefore, what the British attempt to do in order to guarantee their imperial position is to come to some kind of diplomatic arrangement with the Russians. The first place that they look for this is with respect to China, where what they're trying to do is reach an arrangement with the Russians where the Russians will agree to keep all of their efforts here in the north and not threaten the British position based upon Shanghai, which stretches off here into the middle of China. But these agreements, despite one very brief railway agreement, come to naught. And the reason for this is that the Russian position is, simply speaking, too strong. The Russians have no intention of moving out of this area and see no reason to come to any kind of agreement with the British. The enmity between the two global states is far too great for this to occur. So this is an ongoing British problem with respect to imperial defense. Now, what happens next in 1900, of course, is the Boxer Rebellion, where the Chinese, unhappy with the increasing encroachments of the Europeans, attempt to throw the Europeans out of China and lay siege to the legations in Peking. This results in a general European intervention in which the people with the forces nearest to hand, of course, are the Russians, and the Russians provide the bulk of the force that moves in and lifts the siege of Peking. But the trouble is, of course, that the result of all of this is that this area here is occupied by the Russians temporarily. Now, those of you who are familiar with Russian temporary occupations know that sometimes these can last somewhat longer than are anticipated. This, of course, creates a difficult problem for the British, in as much as Russia is now firmly established in this position. At the same time, there's an ongoing quarrel over the position of Tibet and the position of Persia as well, with, in 1903, George Curzon issuing his famous declaration saying that any Russian advances against Persia will be a casus belli between the two. Britain thus faces a difficult circumstance around 1902-1903. How exactly are they to secure their position imperially without invoking or costing them enormous amounts of money? And what you begin to see is the look, now that Russia has declared itself unwilling to come to any kind of arrangement, is to find some sort of proxy in the Far East who will be willing to help them. And of course here, as we'll talk about next week in much more detail, is the idea that is behind the Anglo-Japanese Alliance. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance, which if you read most textbooks, is put down to the foolish idea that somehow this was an agreement whereby you could take your navy back to Europe to deal with the German threat, was in reality a completely anti-Russian agreement. It was designed to create a circumstance where Japan could not be coerced again, as it had been in the Triple Intervention, and that Britain's possessions in the Far East would be guaranteed by the Japanese. There's a tremendous quarrel about, or debate between Arthur Balfour and Lord Lansdowne, the Secretary of State, about the implications of all of this, whether or not this is a breaking away from isolation, or whether it's merely a regional agreement about all of this. All of it tied to the ideas of imperial defense. Now, at the same time, and reflecting this crisis in imperial defense brought on by the twin crises of the Boer War and the Boxer Rebellion, we find the creation of the Committee of Imperial Defense. Now, it's called Imperial Defense for a very good reason. It's because it's designed to guarantee Britain's position worldwide. And the major topic, the first topic that the Committee of Imperial Defense tackles, is the whole idea of the defense of India, with all of the kinds of ramifications that we've been talking about before. And it underlines the difficulties of the defense of India. When you start talking about the number of troops that are available because of the building of the Russian railways, Russia is now thought to be able to bring an army of perhaps 500,000 to bear against the northwest frontier. This will have to be countered by vast numbers of British troops. And over the course of about 2 years of discussion, we get the idea of moving from about 70,000 to over 550,000 troops will have to be brought from Britain. Now, of course, this is not going to happen because of the problems involved here of conscription, which is unacceptable at the time, particularly when the Liberals come to power at the end of 1905, and it's very expensive. So, in a wonderful compromise, the Committee of Imperial Defence finally decides that 100,000 troops would have to be sent to India at some non-specified date after the outbreak of hostilities, and the whole discussion is allowed to lapse. Now, this does not mean, of course, that they've decided not to defend India. What they have decided, on the other hand, is that diplomacy will have to act in imperial defense in order to make this a possible or a viable thing to do. And here, the Russo-Japanese War is a godsend to the British. It's a godsend to the British because of the defeat of Russia. The impact on Russia of the Russo-Japanese War is enormous. On the actual battlefield, the Russo-Japanese War is essentially a draw. The Japanese are able to win victories, but they're never able to win decisive victories. So in a larger sense, the campaign itself, had it gone another season, I think would have turned in the direction of the Russians. But the Russian, remember that the Baltic Fleet is sent all the way around the Horn of Africa and eventually comes here to the Straits of Tsushima on its way to going up to Vladivostok to refit in order to break the Japanese blockade of this area, and it's entirely sunk by Admiral Togo at the Battle of Tsushima. So the result of this is that the Russian fleet is badly damaged, but it's the domestic impact in Russia that is so profound. You get the beginnings of strikes and uprisings in January and February of 1905 that stretch well on into 1906, which caused the Tsarist government to agree to the Treaty of Portsmouth, which gives up territory, part of Sakhalin, which is here, giving the rise to the title of Count Half Sakhalin to Sergei Witte, who is the man who has to do the negotiations at Portsmouth for all of this. But Russia is very weak in the aftermath. They're also broke. Russian finances are in tatters. So the result of all of this after 1905 is that Russia is much more amenable to some kind of diplomatic solution with the British. The result of all of this is the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. Now, the Anglo-Russian Convention, as I talked about last week, this is often seen as the forming of part of the Triple Entente to face Germany, but it's really nothing of the sort. What it is a sorting out of the colonial rivalries on the northwest frontier. Persia is partitioned between Britain and Russia, the north to Russia, the south to Britain. The Persians are magnanimously allowed to have the middle part of Persia for themselves. Afghanistan, it is agreed, will remain something that Russia will only deal with through the medium of Britain, and Tibet is to be excluded from both sides. There are no military conventions involved here, no tying of Britain to Russia, no necessary commitment to Russia in any kind of European war. It is merely an elimination of these ongoing and long-lasting imperial rivalries on the northwest frontier. And this, of course, is based on the fact that Russia is weak. And as Russia gets stronger in the period before 1914, particularly after 1910, the Russian army is rapidly refurbished. We have two naval programs, one in 1908, one in 1911. We have the Great Program, the Bolshaya Programa of 1912, which is going to increase the Russian army by 1.75 million men by 1917. Think about that and how big an army that is, when the German army, standing army, is about 650,000 at this point. And there's a good argument to be made that this rapid increase in Russian power and this potential that Russia will be able to dominate all of Europe forces Germany in 1914 to the realization that it's now or never. That's a different kind of argument that we could talk about. But as Russian power increases before 1914, so too do the problems on the northwest frontier. As Russia continues to make inroads in Persia, the idea that the middle zone will be left under Persia's control is eroded, and it's very clear by 1914 that the Anglo-Russian Convention is on its last legs. And indeed, beginning in June of 1914, the opening stages of negotiation are begun, which are interrupted, of course, by the outbreak of the First World War in August. So, therefore, it's difficult to project what would have happened, but it seems rather clear that the Anglo-Russian Convention may have collapsed in 1914 or 15 had the war not intervened, and we might have gone back to this problem of imperial defense in its more manifest forms in peacetime. However, just because Britain and Russia are wartime allies, this does not mean the end of thinking about imperial defense in all of this. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire, bringing to an end the Eastern question, that is to say, what's going to happen to the Ottoman Empire after it collapses, as was thought obviously going to happen during the whole of the 19th century. The question is, who's going to get what? And here we see that the concerns about imperial defense are at the bottom of discussions about who's going to get what in all of the negotiations. The Straits Agreement, which the British signed with the Russians in 1914 and is ratified later on in 1915, under the terms of which Russia gets Constantinople and the Straits, the keys to Russia, as it's always thought of, Tsargrad, the city of the Caesars, is based on imperial defense considerations that have decided that it's no longer necessary to keep Russia penned up in the Black Sea by preventing them from having Constantinople and the Straits. I talked about this last time. The change in British thinking, naval thinking, whereby they're going to defend narrow waters with submarines and torpedoes, means that working from Cyprus and from places like Lemnos, the British are going to be able to pen the Russians up without actually controlling Constantinople and the Straits. So they can let Russia have Constantinople, Istanbul. It's Istanbul, not Constantinople, as the song would have it, in order to keep the Russians focused in the First World War on the war against Germany, rather than focusing on their other interest, which is against defeating Austria-Hungary and advancing in the Balkans and against Turkey, which is a fear in all of this. We also have the Treaty of London, which brings Italy into the war. This also involves who gets what in Turkey, with the Russians having a major impact here, the British trying to ensure that perhaps giving Italy part of the Dalmatian coastline will keep the Russians out of the Balkans. They don't want the Russians to have an opening here to be able to go out into the Mediterranean. It makes the blockade, keeping the Russians' fleet out, much more difficult than would be the case otherwise. Later we have the Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne Agreement, which is about who gets what parts of what would be nowadays Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the like. The division between Britain, Russia, and France is sculpted from the British perspective with an eye to keeping the Russians out of their parts of Central Asia. The division of Persia now, the final division of Persia, when Russia gets Constantinople and the Straits, Britain gets an extended portion of Persia. The middle zone of Persia is eliminated and mostly given to the British in order to push the Russians further away now from the Persian Gulf, which has an added significance now because of the discovery of oil and the changeover to oil-burning ships in the decade before the First World War, with all of what this implies for imperial defense. So the British also have a period here. If we could go back to a map that would show us the northwest frontier again, Greg. Yes. If we go back and look at the northwest frontier, what we find is that during the First World War, there is a pan-Turanian movement, this idea of a greater Turkey backed up by the Germans, expanding into Central Asia. And what the British do then is they begin to build an expanded railway network up along the Afghanistan frontier and then along the border of Afghanistan with Persia. And here, this is in part a collaboration. There's a Dunster force that goes up towards the Caspian, which meets up with General Baratov coming down from the north. But really, it's also designed to keep the Russians out of this area in any kind of post-war settlement. So that what we're trying to do is create a British crescent stretching from India into the Middle East to contain Russian expansion into any of this. There is an anti-Russian long-term implication here. There's also an attempt in 1917, when the Russians go out of the war, to reestablish an eastern front using Japanese troops to intervene. And the Japanese troops are going to intervene and possibly come down and join up here by taking over the Trans-Siberian Railway at this point. So, here we have then the basis of a completely different kind of imperial defense, the creation of a shield to keep the Russians to the north. Now, any of you who are interested in NATO, post-1945 NATO, the southern tier, all of these sorts of things, this is very much a precursor of all of this. Now, when the Civil War breaks out in Russia in 1918, Britain, of course, is involved, and Britain is involved in a number of venues, in Vladivostok in the Far East, at Archangel in the north, but most significantly along where General Dunster is in the south. And what they're trying to do there is pen the Russians up, as well as try and create a whole series of independent states in the Caucasus as Russian power recedes out of this, in order to keep the Russians to the north. There's also the fear of Bolshevism that arises here. There's the idea or a fear that Kemal Ataturk, the nationalist leader in Turkey, will create a pan-Turanian state linked up with the Bolsheviks. This is why the British are so adamantly opposed to any kind of existence of a Turkish state which will threaten British imperial interests. By 1923, all of this has come to an end. The British are out of Russia in 1920. They're no longer able to sustain it. It costs too much. They don't have the troops for it. And by 1923, a settlement, an acceptable settlement, has been reached with the Treaty of Lausanne with the newly emerging Turkish state. Now, when all of this comes to an end, what we have then is a recrudescence of the ideological war between Britain and Russia. In the 19th century, it's autocracy versus democracy and liberalism. In the 1920s, 30s, and afterwards, it's, of course, communism, Bolshevism, and the like. What you have to remember is, in terms of imperial defense, this has tremendous implications. The Russians, through the process of the Comintern, the Communist International, are attacking British colonial possessions. In China and in India, there is the threat of a communist-inspired uprising, very similar to the kinds of threats of Tsarist-inspired uprisings in these areas. It also has an impact on Britain's relationship with Japan. And this is when it's time to renew the Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1921. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance had originally been struck to limit Russia's expansion in the Far East. By 1921, this seems no longer possible under force of arms, at least. And as a result of this, what we have is that the British decide not to renew the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, which, as we shall see next time, has some rather serious implications, because if you no longer need Japan to restrain Russia, perhaps you might need Russia to restrain Japan, as we shall see in a few moments here. There's also, of course, the maintenance of a threat on the northwest frontier of India. The 1919 Anglo-Afghan War brings a threat there to an end. The British decide to support the Shah in Persia, but there's still a tremendous fear that there will be a Russian expansion in this area. And indeed, what the British are afraid of is that they will be pulled into a war between, say, Afghanistan and Russia, as is threatened in 1926, when there are border clashes classes on the axis between between Afghanistan and Russia in all of this. There are British plans for attacks on Russia's oil supplies in Baku, and air plans for naval and air plans for attacks in all of this. One of the problems involved here, of course, for Imperial Defence is that the British cannot give too definite a support to either the Persians or the Afghans. In particular, one of the charming remarks about telling Afghanistan that they would support Afghanistan against any kind of Russian incursions would, as one official said, place the decision for war or peace in the hands of an unscrupulous barbarian, as they referred to the Emir of Afghanistan. Now, of course, as things change in the 1930s, as the political outlook changes, as you get a rise of revisionist powers such as Japan, Germany, and Italy, Britain has to redesign its imperial defense. And the Defense Requirements Subcommittee, which meets in 1933, sets new priorities for British defense. They set as its first priority the defense of the Far East against the Japanese threat. As its second priority, the ultimate enemy, Germany. And the defense of India drops down to third place, by far the lowest position it's held in British imperial defense since at least 1860 and possibly since 1790. But that's that's beyond the scope of our course. But there is still concern about any kind of attack on Afghanistan and Persia, and this arises again in 1939-40, as we'll see in just a moment. Russia, however, in this period from 33 to 39, is for the most part seen in its European context, somewhat outside the provisions of imperial defense, with the exception of the fact that in this period, Russia now takes the place that Japan had to defend China against foreign aggression. Except in this case, it's Japanese aggression, not Russian aggression. What the British used throughout the 1930s is to utilize sort of a shadowy alliance with the Russians to support China against Japanese incursions. Just as the British are providing supplies through Hong Kong and on the Burma Road for the Chinese so that they can defend themselves against India, so too the Russians are providing supplies through Central Asia and in very large amounts to support the Chinese against any kind of incursions by the Japanese. Interestingly enough, of course, the Russians are quite willing to provide supplies to Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang against the Chinese communists, because simultaneously with the war between China and Japan, which begins in 1931 in an informal sense and formally in 1937, there's an ongoing civil war in China between the Chinese Communist forces under Mao Zedong and the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek. And here, Stalin and the Comintern are quite willing to support the stronger side, the Kuomintang, so that they will keep the Japanese at bay and that the Japanese will not be able to make inroads against Russia's possessions in the Far East. Russian possessions in the Far East are to be defended then by a combination of things, by Russian military force and by enticing the Japanese to stay involved in the Chinese bog. The Battle of Khalkhin-Gol or Nomonhan underlines this quite thoroughly with the Japanese, this right here. Battles in this area here and up here, all along here. There are endless, throughout the 1930s, endless border clashes in this area where the Russians demonstrate quite clearly how the Japanese forces are unable to deal with a European-style mechanized army, which underlines, of course, what happens at the end of the Pacific War as well in 1944 and 45. So there's a tremendous irony in all of this. Russia becomes the defender of British interests in the Far East against Japan, just as Japan had been the defender of British interests in the Far East against Russia for this period. Now, in the period from 1939 to 1941, after the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact until the German invasion, Operation Barbarossa, of Russia in 1941, Russia becomes a malevolent neutral again in all of this. And the Russian threat to the Middle East, Persia and Afghanistan, as Britain's Imperial Defence forces are tied up defending North Africa, increases again. So we have the return of a real Anglo-Russian, or in this case Soviet, enmity. This is brought to an end, at least on paper, in 1941. Britain and Russia, in fact, submerged their differences on the northwest frontier by occupying Persia jointly in order to provide a second line of supplies to the embattled Russians against the Germans. But remember that this is, again, rather temporary and not any kind of lasting alliance. It's not at all surprising that there is a Cold War that breaks out after the Second World War, because between Britain and Russia, there's a Cold War that goes back to at least 1854, and possibly much earlier than that. And that Cold War is a global Cold War of a sort based on ideology and on clashing imperial interests. Now, of course, post-1945, just a few quick remarks. Russia is a proxy, is a threat by proxy in China, Korea, Africa, Vietnam. The great game continues in Central Asia, with the Americans taking on the role of the British, defending the Shah of Iran and Afghanistan against the Soviets. And in fact, you can even apply all of this to the Soviet-Afghan War after 1979, 1789, I'm thinking French again, applying right up to 1987. So, in conclusion, let me say a few things. Russia is clearly the greatest global threat to the British Empire in all of this period, from at least 1800, I would say, until the British Empire's final decline in the 1970s, at which point Britain is bound in with American interests and the great game of the global clash of civilization carries on. And this, I don't think, should be surprising to anyone who thinks of these two countries not just as European countries, but to think of them of what they truly are in this period. Britain is a global state. It is not just a small island off the west coast of Europe. It is a global state which occupies a global position, including positions in the Far East and in India, which bring it continually into clash with that other global empire, although in this case not a maritime empire, but a terrene empire, the expansion of Russia, which also clashes with Britain at every given point. There are clashes in the Middle East, there are clashes in Central Asia, there are clashes in the Far East. So that these two dominant world empires are clashing throughout the world. Not surprisingly in all of this, this is the key thing for British defense planners. Imperial defense is the key to British defense planning. The continent takes care of itself because, say, any kind of effort by someone on the continent to establish hegemony, such as Napoleon's or the Kaisers, automatically generates opposition from other well-placed states, the other powerful European great powers. This is not the case for Britain globally. Britain has to defend its global empire for the most part by itself, and therefore when Britain's own efforts are required, this is where Britain will focus its efforts. Therefore, this is why Russia, not a Germany, is the most important thing when you consider British defense planning, imperial planning, in the last 200 years. Thank you very much.
Professor Neilson was asked the following three questions. Question 1. The political left in Britain have focused their concern with the Nazi and fascist threat since the 1930s. To what extent do you think this has been a deliberate device to take attention off Soviet-Russian policy aimed at the destruction of the British Empire?
That's a fascinating question, one I hadn't really thought about all that much. The German the focus on Germany goes back before this period. It goes back as a result of the two world wars. And it's driven by British military historians, for the most part, who want to focus on what Britain has done in the 20th century. And it really sort of reminds me of what the difference is between focusing on how well you do in an international match and how you do in the third division. People automatically view all of these imperial wars as little wars and unimportant, as opposed to being the fact that this is where people spent all their time doing things, and this is where the focus was. So if you are a British military historian, you want to influence policy after 1945, you want to keep the government's firm eye on the continent. You keep talking about the Continental Commitment as the focus of, and always has been, and must have always been, and should always be in the future, the focus of British defence policy. So that's quite natural, and it's much more interesting to write about these sorts of things, because then you're playing in a big league. It's like going into the World Cup as opposed to talking about some minor competition against the Zulu or something, where no one really cares. This other idea you have, I think, is quite a fascinating one, this idea that this has been used deliberately by people on the political left. To some extent, that's absolutely true. It's why we talk about the Holocaust and not about what Stalin does in the 1930s. Stalin is a far nastier man than Hitler. Hitler at least had a focus. He had one group he didn't like, and he tried to get rid of them. Stalin had a whole bunch of people he didn't like and got rid of far more of them. Now, this is not it's not sort of saying my gulag is worse than your Holocaust. Not at all. I mean, both of these are appalling things. But the amount of attention, Robert Conquest's work, Robert Conquest throughout the 1950s and 60s and 70s is writing endlessly about saying, look at the Great Terror. And for every book on the Great Terror, there's 100 books about the Holocaust. So people on the political left who want to be nasty to the Nazis and to the Germans and to make this the focus of things can't, of course, say, well, it was just one of nastiness. Because the Soviets helped us to defeat the Germans, therefore the Soviets must actually be nice people. You see this in the arguments about the rise of the Cold War amongst the revisionist left historians, that somehow the Soviets in 1945 were a charming, wonderful group of people who wanted to maintain this lovely wartime alliance, and it was the actions of Britain and the United States, the Western Allies, who rejected this, that caused the collapse and the outbreak of the Cold War. Now, to my mind, this is absolute nonsense. Anyone who believes this believes in the tooth fairy. The Soviets were not nice. They were never nice. And it's absolutely good riddance to bad rubbish to have gotten rid of the Soviet model in Russia and around the world. So the trouble is, though, that if you're going to talk about the 1930s and you're going to blame people and have guilty men and appeasement and things like this, well, what are the alternatives? Well, the alternative that's always put forward is the idea of some kind of alliance with Soviet Russia to defend against Hitler and the Nazis. But of course, an alliance with Soviet Russia would have meant letting Soviet Russia occupy Poland instead and the Baltic states under the concept of indirect aggression. If you look at the negotiations in 1939, when the British and the French are discussing with Russia, what do you want to come into an anti-Nazi alignment? They say, well, we want to have a definition of indirect aggression, which means that should there be a case, you go back to the Czechoslovakia, what happened in Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, is that if there's a third column in Poland, or a fifth column in Poland, that looks like they're just going to give in to the Germans, well, we'd like to be able to occupy Poland in order to take it over to prevent this. Well, of course, as soon as you say that, they'll find a fifth column and invade Poland. So why would it be better for Britain and France to have the Soviet Union invade Poland than it would be to have the Nazis invade Poland? It doesn't do much for the Poles. I mean, it's like the old Polish joke. What do you do if you're invaded by the Germans and by the Soviets simultaneously? Who do you reserve a fight against first? And the argument is you fight the Germans first because it's business before pleasure. in all of this. So here's the circumstance. The Soviet actions, quite clearly, in my opinion, the Soviet actions were based on an ideological desire. And I'm not trying to argue some sort of Cold War warrior thing. It's quite clear that Stalin is a communist and that the communists believe eventually they were going to take over all of Europe, if not the world, in the millennial occurrence. So I don't see any real advantage to this. But when it comes to the writing of history, of course, if you are a person who believes in how bad the people are in the 1930s, the appeasers, and the only reason that they didn't do this is because of ideological predilections, then you have to downplay what the Soviets are like. And therefore the Russians have to get airbrushed out of history as a bad force and be brushed back in as a positive force. And they don't want to extend back to Tsarist Russia because everyone knows that Tsarist Russia was bad anyway. It's very interesting. If you look at the British political left, before 1914, they are in the radical wing of the Liberal Party. They hate Tsarist Russia. Absolutely loathe it. They want no alliance with, no association with. The same people become part and parcel of the Labour Party, in fact of the ILP, after the war, and they're very much in favor of a Soviet agreement. Because I think of blind thinking in both cases, personally.
Question 2. Does that explain Lloyd George's attitude towards the Bolsheviks then, with ending the British intervention with civil war and opening negotiations?
Well, Lloyd George's was perfectly rational. From a British perspective, Lloyd George is the head of a coalition government, and the economy is very bad. He needs to do two things. He needs to get stability at home by getting rid of the need to maintain this very expensive army in the intervention. He always used to say to people, how many men are you going to send, and how much money are you going to spend? None, in both cases. Then his answer was, well, then we can't do an intervention, can we? But then his idea at the Genoa Conference is to bring Soviet Russia back into the Comity of Nations so that to increase British trade. Now, by increasing British trade, he can solve the domestic problems at home. He can eliminate problems on the left. And, of course, he is also a liberal in the sense that he believes that free trade will tame rogue states. If we just trade with them, we'll all get along. This, I think, is a great fallacy with our present-day dealings with China. Some sort of mistaken belief that the Chinese are actually pleasant. The Chinese regime is a pleasant one. It's not. It's just one that you can trade with.
Question 3. Do you think that during the interwar period, both Britain and Russia had the misconception that Poland was the main strategic threat?
No one ever does anything except for their own advantage. The Soviet or the Russian fear that the British would somehow do anything to affect Central Asia is based upon a preposterous assumption that the British could do something. Think about the logistic difficulties. It's hard enough to get troops to India as opposed to take them up the Khyber Pass, through the mountains, across Central Asia, 1,000 miles of Saskatchewan, for any Canadian out there, and then you're still nowhere. It always reminds me of the fear that when Japan threatened to land troops in Alaska in the Second World War, the obvious answer would have been let them, and then send two mounted policemen up to arrest the survivors at the end of the first year. So the possibility of attacking of Russia by the British is absolutely nil. Now, the Young Husband expedition, the one in Tibet in 1903, was the actions of a man on the spot. Young Husband was immediately recalled and not made Young Husband of Tibet and given a medal, unlike Kaufman of Turkestan was, which was an obvious, the Russian expansion into Central Asia was a clear-cut expansion directed by the Tsar himself, and with the intention of taking over this area. Young Husbands was a bit of stupidity, which got his wrist slapped, and quite rightfully so. Of course, nobody's more obnoxious than the Poles, maybe the Latvians and Lithuanians. Everybody in Eastern Europe in this period, right after the First World War, is highly obnoxious. But one of the key points to remember is that one of the reasons why the Poles, Latvians, and Lithuanians are anti-Russian is because Russia had occupied them for several hundred years. This always tends to make people somewhat more touchy on these points. Now, of course, the Poles did have these fantasies, as the Russo-Polish War of 1920-21 shows, of creating the Poland of the 13th century, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And I've always had the fantasy of playing first division football, but it's your lack of ability that tends to make it so that you can't. Poland is not really a threat to anyone in this period simply because Poland isn't strong enough to be a threat. They're a threat to Lithuania, but they're not a threat to Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia's threats are a question of misperception, as was pointed out, but it's a perception based upon ideological prejudice. You can call anybody's ideology a prejudice. But if you believe that you are indeed the cradle of socialism, that you're surrounded by ravenous capitalist states that have every intention of destroying you, naturally enough you tend to see the external world in these colors. And from that perspective, from the Soviet perspective, all of the surrounding countries are a threat to the Soviet Union in this period. The only variation is how big a threat. What are your capabilities? What are the iron reality or the concrete realities, as Lenin would always put it, of their ability to threaten you? This is why Britain is considered to be the major threat to the Soviet Union in the interwar period, is because Britain is viewed as the strongest of the capitalist powers in all of this time.
Professor Neilson can be contacted by email at Neilson, that's Neilson, -K @rmc.ca.